Most people believe change begins with motivation, a surge of determination, a powerful realization, a moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. They believe that moment will transform them, that a strong decision will permanently reshape their behavior. But motivation is unstable. It rises and disappears without warning. It feels powerful in the moment and weak the next day. This is why so many people experience the same cycle: a burst of motivation, a few days of intense effort, then a gradual return to old behavior. They assume the problem is discipline. They assume they simply need stronger willpower. But willpower is not the real problem. The real problem is structure. Because behavior does not exist in isolation, it emerges from systems, from patterns repeated every day, from habits that quietly shape how decisions are made. If your daily structure supports distraction, distraction becomes easy. If your environment encourages delay, delay becomes automatic. The mind adapts to whatever system surrounds it. It follows the path that requires the least resistance, the routine that has been practiced most often. This is why motivation alone cannot produce lasting change. Motivation can start movement, but it cannot sustain movement, because motivation requires constant emotion, and emotion is temporary. Habits operate differently. They do not require excitement. They do not require inspiration. They require repetition. The first time a behavior is difficult, the second time it is slightly easier. After enough repetition, the mind begins to automate it. This automation is powerful because it removes the need for motivation. The action simply happens. Wake up, start the work, train, repeat. At first, these actions require effort, but over time, the resistance fades. The routine becomes familiar, predictable. Eventually, the behavior stops feeling optional. It becomes the normal structure of your day. This is the quiet power of habit. It replaces motivation with structure, emotion with repetition, excitement with consistency. And consistency always outlasts intensity. Because intensity burns quickly, consistency compounds slowly. Day after day, action after action, habit after habit, until progress stops depending on how you feel and begins depending on what you repeat. The mind always chooses the path it recognizes, not the path that leads to the best outcome, not the path that matches your goals, the path it knows. This is the hidden power of habit. It turns behavior into familiarity, and familiarity quietly becomes preference. Even when the behavior is harmful, if your routine includes constant distraction, your mind begins to expect distraction. Silence feels uncomfortable. Focus feels unnatural. If your routine includes procrastination, delay begins to feel normal. Urgency begins to feel stressful. The brain is not designed to pursue difficulty. It is designed to conserve energy, to repeat patterns that require the least effort. This is why old habits are difficult to break, not because people lack discipline, because their brain has optimized those behaviors. They have become efficient. You do not consciously decide to open social media. Your hand reaches for it automatically. You do not debate whether to postpone a task. Your mind delays it without resistance. That is what repetition creates. Automatic behavior, a default response that appears before conscious thought. Now consider the opposite. What happens if discipline becomes the familiar path? If work begins automatically? If effort feels normal? If consistency becomes routine? Suddenly the equation changes, because discipline no longer requires constant decision. The action begins without debate. The routine continues without emotional struggle. This is the quiet transformation habits create. They remove friction from the behaviors you repeat most. If distraction is repeated, distraction becomes easy. If discipline is repeated, discipline becomes easy. The brain does not judge the quality of the habit. It strengthens whatever you repeat. That repetition becomes your behavioral gravity, the direction your life slowly drifts toward. This is why two people with identical goals can produce completely different outcomes. One repeats disciplined behavior. The other repeats delay. Months pass. The gap grows quietly. Years pass. The difference becomes undeniable. One life moves forward through steady repetition. The other circles through familiar patterns. Not because their goals were different, because their habits were.
If this message resonates with you,
Like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who want control over their focus, not constant noise. There is a moment most people never notice. The moment where a habit becomes identity. At first, behavior feels temporary. You wake early for a few days. You train consistently for a week. You focus on work for a short period. Then the mind begins to draw conclusions. Small, quiet conclusions. This is what you do. This is how you behave. This is who you are. Identity rarely forms through declarations. It forms through repetition, through the actions you repeat often enough that they stop feeling unusual. A person who trains regularly begins to see themselves as disciplined. A person who delays action begins to see themselves as inconsistent. A person who avoids discomfort begins to see effort as unnatural. None of these identities were chosen directly. They were built quietly, action by action, habit by habit. Once identity forms, behavior becomes easier to predict, because people tend to protect the identity they believe about themselves. A disciplined person wakes up and works, not because they debate the decision, because the behavior matches who they believe they are. Meanwhile, someone who sees themselves as inconsistent approaches the same task differently. They hesitate, they delay, they negotiate with themselves. The identity shapes the behavior, and the behavior reinforces the identity. This loop becomes powerful. Each repeated action strengthens the belief behind it. Each belief strengthens the next action. Eventually, the pattern becomes stable. Discipline becomes natural, or delay becomes normal. At that point, effort begins to feel different. The disciplined person experiences less resistance. The inconsistent person experiences constant friction. Not because the work changed, because the identity behind the work changed. That identity was not created through a powerful moment. It was built through repetition. Small actions repeated long enough to shape self-perception. This is why habits are more powerful than goals. Goals aim at outcomes. Habits shape identity, and identity quietly controls behavior. Day after day, choice after choice, until the life you live begins to match the habits you repeated.
Most people try to change their life through
Effort alone. They believe success is created through intensity, through sudden bursts of motivation, through moments where they force themselves to act. For a short time, this works. Energy is high, progress appears quickly, but intensity is temporary. Motivation fades, energy drops, discomfort begins to grow. This is where most people collapse back into old behavior, not because they lack ambition, because they lack systems. A system is simply a structure that repeats behavior, a routine that removes decision, a pattern that makes the right action easier than the wrong one. Without systems, every action becomes a debate. Should I start the work? Should I train today? Should I delay this task? And constant decision creates fatigue. The mind grows tired of negotiating with itself. Soon, the easier option begins to win. Delay, comfort, distraction. Systems remove that negotiation. They turn effort into routine. They turn discipline into structure. Wake up at the same time. Start work at the same hour. Train on the same days. At first, the system feels restrictive, uncomfortable, rigid. But repetition slowly changes the experience. The routine becomes familiar. The actions require less mental effort. Eventually, the system carries you forward. Even when motivation disappears, even when energy is low, even when progress feels slow. Because the system no longer depends on emotion. It depends on repetition. That repetition becomes momentum, and momentum becomes progress. Quiet progress, invisible progress, progress that compounds slowly, until one day the difference becomes obvious. Not because you pushed harder, because you repeated the right actions long enough, and repetition always wins. In the end, most people misunderstand what creates results. They believe success comes from ambition, from powerful goals, from moments of intense determination. But ambition is common. Goals are common. Almost everyone wants a better life. Very few people build the habits required to support it. Because habits require something goals do not. Repetition, patience, consistency without immediate reward. Habits ask you to repeat the same action long before the result becomes visible, long before progress feels dramatic. That repetition feels insignificant in the moment, almost too small to matter. One day of discipline, one training session, one focused hour of work. But repetition compounds, quietly, relentlessly. The first week changes little. The first month feels slow. But the pattern continues. Day after day, habit after habit, routine after routine, until something begins to shift. The action becomes automatic. The resistance begins to fade. The routine begins to carry you forward. At that point, discipline no longer depends on motivation. It depends on structure, on habits strong enough to guide behavior. This is the quiet advantage habits create. They continue working when emotion disappears, when energy drops, when motivation fades. Because habits do not require excitement, they require repetition. Over time, that repetition becomes identity. A disciplined person becomes someone who trains, someone who works, someone who continues. Meanwhile, the person who repeated delay becomes someone who hesitates, someone who restarts, someone who never builds momentum. Years pass. The difference becomes obvious, not because their goals were different, because their habits were. That is the rule most people ignore. You do not rise to your goals. You fall to your habits. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. Your habits are already shaping your future. When it finally shows, it doesn't start where people think. It doesn't begin with success. It begins with separation. Not visible at first, not obvious, just small differences in position, in timing, in access. Two people doing similar work, but getting different outcomes. One starts to move slightly ahead, the other stays where they are. At first, it doesn't look like much. No major results, no dramatic shift. Just subtle divergence. Because the early returns of unseen work are not results. They are positioning. Where you stand begins to change. What you see earlier, what you understand sooner, what you're able to act on before others. These shifts are small, but they matter. Because timing is not random, it is a function of where you are. And unseen days move you. Not externally at first, but internally. How you think, how you respond, how quickly you recognize patterns. So when something appears, you're not reacting. You're already aligned, already prepared. This is the first return. Not money, not status. Clarity. You start seeing things before they become obvious. And that changes your actions. Slightly. You move earlier. You decide faster. You hesitate less. Not because you're guessing, but because you've already processed it. That processing was built during unseen days. Repetition without reward. Effort without confirmation. So when others are trying to understand, you're already acting. And that creates distance. Not dramatic, but enough. Enough to separate outcomes over time. Because small advantages compound. Not in one moment. Across many. And most people don't notice this phase because it doesn't look like success. It looks like nothing. Just slight differences. But those differences are the beginning of everything that follows.
The separation doesn't announce itself.
It builds in a way that feels insignificant. Small differences in timing, small differences in decision, small differences in what you notice and what you ignore. And because the differences are small, they are easy to dismiss. You don't feel ahead. You don't look different. So from the outside, nothing has changed. You're still in the same place, same environment, same people, same conditions. But internally, the structure is different. The way you process information, the way you respond to pressure, the speed at which you recognize patterns. That's where the shift is happening. And it starts affecting decisions. Not the big ones, the small ones. When to act, when to wait, what to ignore, what to commit to. Most people don't realize how much these decisions matter, because each one feels minor. But minor decisions control direction. And direction, repeated over time, creates distance. Distance most people can't explain. Two people start in the same position. One begins to move slightly differently. Not faster, not harder, different. And that difference comes from unseen days, from the way repetition reshaped perception, the way silence forced deeper processing. So when a situation appears, they don't react the same way. One hesitates, the other recognizes. One waits for confirmation, the other acts before it's obvious. And that timing creates advantage. Not dramatic advantage, just enough to move first, just enough to position slightly ahead. And once you move first, the environment responds differently. You encounter less resistance, less competition, because most people are still processing what you've already acted on. And by the time they move, the position is already taken. This is how separation accelerates, not through effort alone, through timing. And timing is not luck. It's preparation meeting visibility. Preparation that was built before anything appeared. That's why unseen days matter, not because they immediately produce results, but because they change how you interact with opportunity. You stop chasing it. You start recognizing it earlier than others. And recognition is what creates access. Not effort alone, but the ability to see what others don't see yet. That's the second layer. Unseen work doesn't just build capacity, it builds awareness. And awareness is what begins to separate outcomes. Long before results appear. If this message resonates with you, like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who are done waiting. At a certain point, the difference stops being subtle, not visually, functionally. Because once positioning begins to shift, the environment starts responding differently, not to your effort, to your placement. You enter situations earlier, before they become obvious, before they become crowded, and that changes everything. Less resistance, less competition, more control over decisions. Not because you're better, but because you're earlier. And earlier is one of the most powerful advantages there is. Because most people don't operate early. They operate when something becomes visible, when it's confirmed, when it's safe, when it's already moving. And by then, the structure is set. Positions are taken. Opportunities are distributed. Momentum is already assigned. So they enter late. And late always feels harder. More competition, more friction, less room to move. Not because the system changed, but because their timing did. This is where the gap begins to widen. Not through effort differences, through access differences. One person is interacting with opportunity before it expands. The other is interacting with it after it becomes obvious. And those are not the same environments. Early environments are quiet, less noise, less attention, less competition. Late environments are crowded, more noise, more reaction, more people trying to extract value from the same moment. And that compresses outcomes. Because too many people are acting at the same time, so even if the effort is equal, the result is not. Because one person is early and one is late. This is where unseen days convert, not into immediate results, but into timing advantage. You begin to see shifts before they expand, patterns before they become obvious, movement before it becomes crowded. And that allows you to act with less resistance, less hesitation, less pressure, because you're not competing yet. You're positioning, and positioning happens before competition. That's the shift. You stop reacting to what exists and start aligning with what is forming. And most people never operate there because they never stayed long enough to develop the awareness required to see it. So they remain in reactive environments, competing late, acting late, moving when it's already obvious, and wondering why it feels harder, when in reality, they're just arriving after the advantage is gone, after the space has filled, after the structure has already formed. And this is where most people misunderstand it. They think the outcome comes from effort alone. More hours, more intensity, more visible work. But effort without direction just creates fatigue, not separation, not advantage. Because if the timing is wrong, the environment absorbs your effort. You push, but nothing moves. And over time, that creates doubt. It starts to feel like nothing is working, like the effort isn't translating. But the issue isn't effort, it's alignment, where that effort is being applied. Most people apply effort after things are already active, after opportunities are visible, after attention has already formed, which means they're entering crowded space, where movement is restricted, where outcomes are compressed. So even if they work hard, they're working inside limitations, inside an environment that's already saturated. And that's why it feels like effort isn't enough, because in that environment, it isn't. But when effort is applied early, before visibility, before competition, it behaves differently. It expands. There's more room to move, more room to shape outcomes, less friction, less noise, less interference, because the environment hasn't filled yet. It hasn't reacted yet. So the same effort produces a different result, not because it's stronger, but because it's placed differently. That's the part no one sees. They see the result later, but they don't see where the effort was applied. They don't see that it happened before anything was obvious, before anyone was paying attention, before it looked valuable. And that's why it feels invisible, because it didn't exist in a visible environment. It existed in silence, in repetition, in low feedback conditions, where nothing confirms you're on the right path. And that's where most people stop, not because they can't continue, but because nothing is reinforcing them. No recognition, no visible progress, no external signal. Just effort, without immediate return. So they shift, they wait, they move toward what already looks active, and by doing that, they enter late, into environments where the advantage is already gone, where effort has less impact. And that's the cycle. Leave early environments too soon and spend your time competing late, while the ones who stayed continue building in silence, until that silence turns into separation. By the time it becomes visible, it's already decided. Not in that moment, long before it. What you're seeing is not the start of success. It's the surface of something that has already formed. Quietly. Position has already shifted. Timing has already aligned. Access has already changed. So when it appears, it looks sudden. It looks like a moment, a breakthrough. But it isn't. It's a release of everything that was built when nothing was visible. All those early decisions, the ones that didn't feel important, the ones that didn't feel like they mattered. They accumulated, not externally, structurally. They changed how you see, how you respond, how you move through opportunity before it became obvious. And that's why the outcome is different. Not because you worked harder, but because you were earlier. Earlier in perception, earlier in action, earlier in positioning. And once that compounds, it separates outcomes permanently, because you're no longer reacting to the same environment. You're operating ahead of it, before it fills, before it becomes crowded, before it becomes obvious. And that's where the advantage exists, not in effort alone, but in when and where that effort is applied. Most people never see this, because they only recognize outcomes, not the positioning that created them. They see success, but not the unseen days that placed it, not the timing that shaped it. So they try to replicate the result without understanding the structure. And it doesn't work, because the structure was built before it was visible, in silence, in repetition, in decisions that looked insignificant at the time, but changed everything later. That's the difference. Success is not built in the moment it appears. It is built in how you positioned yourself when nothing was showing yet. Like the video, subscribe.
No one sees this part.
Not the beginning, not the middle, and definitely not the repetition. They only see what survives long enough to become visible. But before anything becomes visible, it exists in isolation. Days that look identical, effort that leaves no trace, work that resets the moment it ends. Nothing carries over, nothing confirms itself. So it feels like nothing is happening. This is where perception starts to distort, because the mind measures progress through feedback, through reaction, through change, through evidence. And here, there is none. So the work begins to feel disconnected from reality. You show up, you execute, you finish, and nothing reflects it back to you. No shift in position, no change in outcome, no signal that anything is compounding. Just silence. And that silence is what most people cannot tolerate. Not because the work is difficult, but because it feels unrecognized, untracked, unreal. So they begin to adjust. They shorten the effort. They delay the start. They look for something that responds faster. Not because it's better, but because it feels like something is happening. Movement becomes more important than direction. This is where most paths break. Not at failure, not at resistance, but at invisibility. When effort no longer produces a feeling. Because unseen work requires a different kind of stability, not emotional, structural. You are not reacting to outcomes. You are committing to a process that has not proven itself yet. That is where the separation begins. Some people require confirmation before they continue. Others continue without it. And over time, that difference compounds. Because unseen days are not empty, they are accumulative, even when they appear static. Each repetition reinforces something internal, not visible skill, not external results, but tolerance. Tolerance for silence, tolerance for delay, tolerance for doing something that does not immediately return anything. And that tolerance becomes capacity. Most people never build that capacity because they exit before it forms. They interpret the absence of results as absence of progress. But those are not the same thing. Progress is often invisible while it is forming, because it is not expressed externally yet. It is being constructed internally, and internal construction does not announce itself. This is why the early phase feels stagnant, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening where you cannot see it. And if you rely on visibility to validate effort, you will stop before it surfaces. That is the pattern. People don't fail because they can't do the work. They fail because they cannot stay in the phase where the work is not visible. So they leave, too early to see it. What makes unseen days difficult is not the work itself. It is the absence of confirmation. Because most people are not trained to operate without feedback, they rely on signals, progress indicators, external response, visible movement. Something that tells them, this is working. Without that, the mind starts to question the process. Not aggressively, subtly. It begins with small adjustments, shortening the session, delaying the start, replacing depth with activity. Nothing dramatic, just enough to reduce discomfort. Because the real pressure is not physical, it is psychological. You are continuing something that has not proven itself yet, and that creates friction. The mind wants alignment between effort and result, cause and effect, input and output. But in this phase, that alignment does not exist yet. So the system feels broken, even when it isn't. Because the timeline is delayed. What you do today does not return today. It stores, and storage is difficult to perceive. There is no visible accumulation, no immediate reflection, no confirmation that anything is building. So people start optimizing for what they can feel. Faster feedback, quicker outcomes, more visible progress, even if it's shallow, because it removes uncertainty. But that shift changes the trajectory. They move from building something that compounds to engaging in something that responds quickly. And those are not the same. Compounding systems feel slow early, almost static, because the return is delayed. But once it begins, it separates. Reactive systems feel productive early, because they return immediately. But they plateau. Most people choose what responds, not what builds, because response is visible, and visibility feels like progress. This is the mechanism. Unseen days create uncertainty. Uncertainty creates pressure. Pressure drives people toward immediate feedback, and that breaks the process. Not because the work is wrong, but because the timeline was misunderstood. You expected alignment too early, so you adjusted the process to match your expectations, instead of adjusting your expectations to match the process. And that shift changes everything. Because once you require confirmation to continue, you become dependent on visibility. And anything that builds slowly will feel wrong, even when it's correct. So you stop, not at failure, but at uncertainty, before the return phase begins. And that is why most effort never converts. Not because it wasn't enough, but because it wasn't sustained long enough, without confirmation. If this message resonates with you, like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who want control over their focus, not constant noise. There is a point where the work stops feeling neutral and starts turning against you. Not externally, internally. Because the longer you stay in unseen effort, the more it begins to expose something. Not your discipline, your limits. What you can tolerate, what you avoid, what you actually are when no one is watching. At first, it's quiet, small thoughts. This isn't doing anything. This doesn't feel right. This might be a waste of time. Nothing aggressive, just enough to create doubt. But doubt doesn't stay small. It compounds, the same way effort does. And over time, it becomes convincing. Because you have no evidence to oppose it. No results, no feedback, no shift in reality. So the mind fills the gap. And what it fills it with is usually wrong. But it feels accurate, because it matches what you see. Nothing. That's the fracture point. Not when the work becomes difficult, but when the absence of results becomes believable. This is where people start rewriting the narrative. This path isn't for me. I chose the wrong thing. I should pivot. Not based on failure, based on discomfort. And it feels rational, because from the outside, there is no visible progress to defend. So leaving feels justified. But what's actually happening is different. You're not responding to reality, you're responding to the absence of visible change. And those are not the same. Because reality may be shifting without presenting itself yet, but you don't wait long enough to see it. So you reset, start something new, re-enter the early phase, where effort feels clean again, because expectation resets with it. And that cycle repeats. Start, push, feel nothing, doubt, leave. Over and over. Not because you lack discipline, but because you never stayed long enough to reach the phase where effort becomes visible. So everything feels like it doesn't work, when in reality, you just keep exiting before it shows. That's the cost. Unseen days don't just test patience. They reveal instability, not in your ability, but in your tolerance for delayed reality. And most people fail that test, quietly, without realizing it. They don't collapse, they just leave, before anything could have proven itself. There is no moment where it suddenly makes sense. No point where the work looks back at you and confirms itself. That expectation is the problem, because you are waiting for clarity from something that was never designed to provide it. The process does not explain itself. It just continues. Same actions, same structure, same repetition. Nothing changes on the surface, so the mind keeps checking. Is this working? Am I getting closer? Should something be happening by now? And every time it checks, it finds nothing, because it's looking in the wrong place. It's looking for visible proof, while the work is still forming invisibly. So it keeps interrupting the process, not by stopping completely, but by questioning constantly. And that questioning creates instability. Small hesitations, small delays, small reductions in intensity. Nothing dramatic, but enough to slow everything down. Because consistency is not just showing up. It's showing up without interference, without needing to evaluate every step. That's the shift most people never make. They continue the work, but they keep checking it, and that keeps them tied to outcomes. So even when they stay, they're not fully committed. Part of them is still waiting, still measuring, still expecting something to appear. And that expectation keeps the process fragile. Because if nothing shows, they're ready to leave at any point. The people who actually reach the next phase remove that condition. They stop waiting for the work to prove itself, and instead, they stabilize their execution. They do the same thing at the same standard, regardless of what it looks like externally. No checking, no adjusting, no negotiating, just continuation. And over time, that removes friction completely, because the work is no longer tied to outcome. It becomes independent, and that independence is what allows it to compound, quietly, without interruption. So nothing feels different, but everything is different. Because now, you're no longer waiting for results. You're building something that will produce them later.
When it finally appears,
It won't feel how you expected. No rush, no surge, no dramatic shift. Just recognition. A small moment where something works, and you notice it. Not because it's loud, but because it's different. The output is cleaner, the movement is sharper, the execution is more stable. And it feels controlled, not forced. That's when you realize it's been building. Not recently, from the beginning. All those days that looked empty, they weren't empty. They were forming structure. The repetition, the silence, the lack of feedback. It wasn't absence. It was accumulation. And now it shows. Not all at once, but enough to confirm something. That the work was never disconnected. It was just delayed. And delay was the cost of building something real. Most people never reach this point because they needed to see it earlier. They needed proof before it was ready to appear. So they left, not knowing they were close, closer than they realized. And that's the difference. Not talent, not intelligence, not even effort. Duration. How long you can continue without seeing anything, without needing anything back, without questioning it. Because success is not built in the moment it appears. It is built in days no one sees. Days that felt pointless. Days that felt silent. Days that felt disconnected. But they weren't. They were the entire process. And if you stayed through them, then what appears later is not luck. It's the result of everything you did when nothing seemed to matter. Like the video. Subscribe. The body is rarely the first thing to quit. It feels like it is. The burning in your muscles, the weight in your chest, the exhaustion building with every step. It feels physical. It feels real. It feels final. But most of the time, the body is still capable. What actually quits first is the mind. The mind sends signals. Stop. Slow down. This is enough. And those signals feel convincing because they are designed to protect you, to conserve energy, to avoid discomfort. But protection is not the same as limitation. The mind does not measure your true capacity. It estimates. It predicts. It guesses how much you can handle. And it almost always underestimates because it is biased toward safety, toward conserving effort, toward avoiding strain. This is why you feel like stopping, long before you are actually finished. You feel tired, but you can take another step. You feel pressure, but you can continue the work. You feel resistance, but you can still act. That gap between what you feel and what you are capable of is where most people stop. Not because they reached their limit, because they believed the signal. They interpreted discomfort as the end. They treated resistance as failure. They assumed the feeling meant they were done. But discomfort is not the signal to stop. It is the signal that effort has begun. The moment it becomes difficult, the moment it becomes uncomfortable, the moment the mind begins to resist, that is where growth starts. The problem is not the discomfort itself. The problem is how quickly people respond to it, how quickly they step back, how quickly they disengage. Because the mind is persuasive. It does not shout. It suggests. It negotiates. Just stop here. You've done enough. You can continue tomorrow. And most people listen, not because they are weak, because they are untrained. Untrained to recognize the difference between real limits and perceived limits. Real limits are physical. They stop you. They force you to rest. Perceived limits are mental. They suggest stopping, but they can be ignored. This distinction changes everything, because once you see it, you stop trusting the first signal. You begin to question it, and that is where control begins. Not when the body feels strong, but when the mind tells you to stop, and you continue anyway. The mind does not tell you to stop all at once. It begins quietly, subtly, almost reasonably. It does not say, "You cannot continue." It says, "Maybe you should stop." That suggestion feels harmless, even logical, even responsible. You've done enough. You can rest now. You can continue later. The mind presents these thoughts as protection, as if stopping is the correct decision, as if continuing would be unnecessary risk. And most people accept it, not because they are incapable, but because the argument sounds reasonable. This is how the mind limits you, not through force, through suggestion, through negotiation, through small permissions to stop. One pause becomes a habit. One delay becomes a pattern. One moment of stopping becomes the standard. And over time, that standard becomes your limit. You begin to associate discomfort with stopping, resistance with quitting, effort with avoidance. Until the moment things become difficult, you automatically disengage. This pattern does not only exist in physical effort, it appears in work, in focus, in discipline. You start a task. You feel resistance. The mind suggests a break. You stop. You return later. The same resistance appears again. The same suggestion returns. And the cycle repeats. This is how progress slows. Not because effort is impossible, but because the mind keeps interrupting it. The interruption feels small, almost insignificant, but repeated often enough, it becomes the dominant pattern. And that pattern shapes your results. Because consistency is broken, momentum is lost. Progress becomes unstable. Meanwhile, the person who continues builds a different pattern. They feel the same resistance. They hear the same suggestions. They experience the same discomfort, but they respond differently. They continue, even if it is slower, even if it is uncomfortable. That small decision creates separation, not immediately, but over time. One person stops when the mind suggests it. The other continues past that suggestion. That difference compounds, quietly, relentlessly, until one person develops endurance and the other develops a habit of stopping. Because the mind always speaks first, but it does not always tell the truth. And learning to ignore it is where discipline begins. If you're serious about building this mindset, follow and subscribe. Everything here is about discipline, focus, and real progress. There is a point most people never reach. Not because they cannot reach it, but because they stop just before it. It comes after the initial resistance, after the first wave of discomfort, after the moment the mind tells you to stop. Most people obey that signal. They step back. They pause the effort. They disengage. But if you continue, something different begins to happen. The discomfort does not disappear immediately, but it begins to change. It becomes more predictable, more manageable. Your breathing stabilizes. Your focus sharpens. Your movement becomes more controlled. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel structured, less chaotic, less urgent. This is the point where most people would have already stopped. They never experience this shift because they interpret the first signal as the limit instead of the beginning. The first wave of resistance is not the end. It is the entry point. Beyond that point, the mind begins to lose control. Its signals become less convincing, less urgent. Because you did not obey it. You continued. That continuation teaches the mind something new. That discomfort is survivable. That resistance is temporary. That effort can extend further than expected. This lesson is powerful because it changes how the mind responds next time. The signal to stop still appears, but it carries less authority, less urgency, less control, because you have already gone beyond it. This is how endurance is built, not through one moment of intensity, but through repeated exposure to resistance. Each time you continue, you expand your threshold. You extend your capacity. You redefine your limits. Not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually. One step further, one repetition longer, one moment past the urge to stop. Over time, these small extensions compound. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. What once felt overwhelming becomes routine. This is where real separation begins, between those who stop at discomfort and those who move through it. Because one group never experiences the shift. They remain limited by the first signal. The other group moves beyond it and discovers a different level of capability, a level that was always there but rarely reached. Because the mind quit first, and they did not follow it. They stayed long enough to see what was actually possible. At a certain point, the process begins to reverse. The mind still speaks. It still sends signals. It still suggests stopping. But the response changes. You no longer react immediately. You no longer treat the signal as a command. You recognize it for what it is, a suggestion, not a limit. This recognition is where control begins to stabilize, because the mind loses its authority. It still speaks, but it no longer decides. You begin to separate sensation from action. Discomfort is present, but it no longer determines your behavior. Fatigue exists. Resistance appears. The urge to stop returns. But you continue anyway. This repetition builds something deeper than motivation. It builds control. It builds stability. It builds discipline that does not depend on how you feel. At this stage, effort becomes different. Not easier, but more structured, more predictable. The mind still resists, but the resistance no longer disrupts the process. It becomes part of it. Something expected, something normal. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They believe disciplined people feel less resistance. They believe effort becomes easy. It does not. The difference is not the absence of resistance. It is the response to it. The disciplined person feels the same signals, the same discomfort, the same urge to stop, but they no longer obey it. That shift creates consistency. Consistency creates momentum. Momentum creates results. And those results begin to reinforce the behavior. They confirm that continuing was correct. They strengthen the pattern. The mind adapts again, but this time it adapts to discipline. It learns that stopping is not automatic. It learns that discomfort does not end the process. Over time, the signals weaken, not because they disappear, but because they lose influence. You begin to operate independently of them. The action continues regardless of how you feel. This is the point where discipline becomes reliable, not dependent on motivation, not dependent on energy, not dependent on mood, only dependent on repetition. And that repetition changes everything, because once the mind loses control, the body is no longer held back, and what once felt like a limit becomes just another step forward. In the end, the difference is not physical. Most people have more capacity than they ever use, more strength, more endurance, more ability than they allow themselves to reach. But that capacity is rarely accessed, not because it does not exist, because the mind interrupts it. The signal appears, stop, slow down, this is enough. And most people follow it, automatically, without questioning it. That is why their limits stay where they are, unchanged, unchallenged. Because limits are not only physical, they are reinforced by behavior, by repeated responses to discomfort. Every time you stop at the first signal, you confirm the limit. You strengthen it. You make it real. Every time you continue, even slightly, you extend it. That extension may feel small, almost insignificant. One more step, one more repetition, one more moment of effort. But those small extensions compound. They reshape your capacity. They redefine your limits. Over time, the difference becomes clear. One person stayed within the signal, the other moved beyond it. Years pass. The gap widens, not dramatically, but steadily. One life remains controlled by discomfort. The other becomes independent from it. That independence is discipline. Not the absence of resistance, but the ability to continue despite it. Because resistance never disappears. The signal never stops. The mind never becomes silent. But your response changes, and that changes everything. You stop obeying the first signal. You stop treating discomfort as the end. You stop accepting the first limit. And once that happens, your capacity expands. Your endurance grows. Your discipline stabilizes. Because the mind may quit first, but you no longer follow it. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. The next limit is already in front of you. Most people believe their future is determined by their goals. They set targets, they write plans, they imagine the person they want to become. A stronger body, a disciplined life, a successful career. These visions feel powerful because they create direction. They give the mind something to chase. But there is a quiet problem hidden inside this belief. Goals exist in the future, but life happens in the present. Not in dramatic turning points, not in rare moments of inspiration, in daily behavior, in routines repeated without attention, in habits that quietly shape every decision. And habits are far stronger than ambition, because habits operate automatically, without negotiation, without effort, without conscious thought. They become the default pattern of your behavior, the path your mind follows when energy is low, when motivation disappears, when pressure appears. This is why strong goals alone rarely change anything. You may decide to wake up early, but if your habit is hitting snooze, that habit will decide your morning. You may decide to train consistently, but if your habit is postponing effort, that habit will shape your day. Because when discipline becomes uncomfortable, the mind does not automatically follow ambition. It follows patterns. Patterns repeated yesterday. Patterns repeated last week. Patterns repeated for years. Those patterns become habits, and habits quietly take control. This is the truth most people avoid. You do not become disciplined because you set a goal. You become disciplined because you repeat disciplined behavior. You do not become focused because you want to be focused. You become focused because your habits train your attention. And the same rule works in the opposite direction. Repeated delay becomes procrastination. Repeated distraction becomes lack of focus. Repeated comfort becomes weakness. Every action reinforces the pattern behind it. Every repetition strengthens the habit. Every habit slowly shapes your identity. At first, the difference is small, almost invisible. But repetition compounds. Day after day, year after year, until the result becomes obvious. One person becomes disciplined, another becomes inconsistent. Not because their goals were different, because their habits were. And when pressure finally appears, when motivation disappears, when effort becomes uncomfortable, you do not rise to your goals. You fall to your habits. That quiet rule shapes every life. The problem with goals is not that they are useless. Goals can create direction. They can clarify intention. They can give the mind something to aim toward. But direction alone does not produce movement, because movement depends on behavior, and behavior depends on habit. Most people ignore this distinction. They focus almost entirely on the destination, the body they want, the life they want. the discipline they hope to have. But they rarely examine the system producing their daily actions. The routines that fill their mornings, the distractions that consume their evenings, the patterns repeated every day without attention. Those patterns quietly determine everything. You may set a goal to train every morning, but if your habit is staying up late, waking early becomes difficult. You may decide to focus on work, but if your habit is constant distraction, focus becomes unstable. This is why many ambitious people remain stuck. Their goals point in one direction, but their habits pull them in another. Every day becomes a small internal conflict. The goal demands effort, the habit demands comfort, and comfort usually wins. Not because people lack ambition, but because habits operate automatically. They require no decision. They follow the path already carved into behavior. That path was built through repetition, through small actions repeated hundreds of times, through routines that slowly became automatic. Once a behavior becomes habitual, it becomes the mind's default response. And defaults are powerful. They appear the moment attention drops, the moment energy fades, the moment discipline feels difficult. This is the moment where goals usually lose, because a goal is an intention, a habit is a behavior, and behavior always decides the outcome. If your habit is discipline, you move forward even when motivation disappears. If your habit is delay, you hesitate the moment effort becomes uncomfortable. That hesitation slowly compounds. Tasks are postponed. Momentum breaks. Consistency disappears. Soon the goal begins to feel distant, unreachable, unrealistic. But the problem was never the goal. The problem was the system supporting it, the habits shaping daily behavior. Because no matter how ambitious your goal may be, your habits will always determine how close you get. And in the end, they decide how far you fall.
If this message resonates with you,
Like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who want control over their focus, not constant noise.
habits do something goals never can.
They remove decision. A goal requires constant intention. You must remember it. You must think about it. You must choose it again and again. But habits operate differently. They run automatically, without negotiation, without motivation. That is why habits quietly control behavior. Because the mind prefers efficiency. It avoids constant decision-making. It follows the path already practiced. Once a behavior has been repeated enough times, the brain turns it into a shortcut, a default response, a routine that runs without effort. This is why habits become powerful over time. They eliminate friction. They remove hesitation. They simplify action. But the same rule works in both directions. Disciplined habits create disciplined lives. Undisciplined habits create undisciplined lives. The mind does not care which one you build. It simply strengthens whatever you repeat. Wake up late enough times, and waking late becomes normal. Procrastinate often enough, and delay becomes automatic. Soon, you are no longer making choices. You are following patterns. This is where most people lose control of their behavior. They believe they are deciding each action, but their habits have already decided. Comfort becomes the default. Distraction becomes the routine. Effort becomes rare. And slowly ambition begins to collapse. Because a goal cannot compete with a habit that runs automatically. A decision must fight resistance. A habit simply executes. This is why disciplined people focus less on goals and more on systems. Small behaviors repeated every day, small routines that remove hesitation, small actions that slowly reshape identity. Eventually, those routines become automatic. The work begins without debate. The effort continues without resistance. And once discipline becomes habitual, progress stops depending on motivation. It becomes inevitable. This is where most people misunderstand change. They try to force discipline through intensity, a sudden burst of motivation, a dramatic new plan. They decide that everything will change at once. Wake up earlier, work harder, eliminate every distraction. For a few days, it works. Energy is high, effort feels exciting, but intensity is temporary. Fatigue appears, discomfort grows. The routine becomes difficult to sustain. Without habits supporting the effort, the system collapses. Momentum disappears. Old patterns return. Not because the goal was wrong, because the structure behind it never changed. A goal can inspire action, but habits sustain action. That difference is everything. A disciplined life is rarely built through dramatic transformation. It is built through small, repeated behaviors. Actions simple enough to repeat every day. Wake up at the same time. Start the work without debate. Train even when progress feels slow. That these actions appear insignificant, but repetition changes their weight. Each day strengthens the pattern. Soon the routine becomes normal. Discipline stops feeling like effort. It becomes the default behavior. The mind no longer debates the action. The action simply happens. That is when habits begin working for you. And when habits begin working for you, progress stops depending on motivation. It becomes part of your daily structure. That structure is stronger than ambition, stronger than emotion, stronger than temporary bursts of effort. Because once habits take control, your behavior stops drifting. It moves in one direction, forward. In the end, the difference between people is rarely ambition. Most people want similar things: a better life, stronger discipline, meaningful progress. The difference is not what they want. The difference is what they repeat. Because repetition becomes habit, and habit quietly becomes identity. A person who trains consistently begins to see themselves as disciplined. A person who delays action begins to see themselves as unreliable. Not because they decided those identities consciously, but because behavior reinforced them. Each repeated action sends a signal. This is who you are. This is how you behave. This is the standard you accept. Over time, those signals accumulate. The mind stops debating them. It simply accepts them. That acceptance becomes powerful because identity shapes behavior, and behavior reinforces identity. A disciplined person does not wake up asking if they should act. Action is already part of who they are. The routine continues without debate. Meanwhile, the person who built habits of delay faces constant resistance. Every task feels heavier. Every effort feels unstable. Every goal feels distant. Not because they lack ability, because their habits built a different identity. One pattern moves forward. The other pattern hesitates. Years pass. The difference grows. What once looked like small habits becomes a completely different life. This is the quiet truth behind every long-term result. You do not become what you want. You become what you repeat. Because when pressure appears, when motivation disappears, when effort becomes uncomfortable, you do not rise to your goals. You fall to your habits. If this message resonated with you, like the video and subscribe. Your habits are already shaping tomorrow. There is a moment where everything inside you tells you to stop. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. It appears as a thought, a suggestion, a simple sentence. This is enough. And most people accept it immediately. They don't question it. They don't examine it. They don't resist it. Because it feels true. It feels accurate. It feels like the body has reached its limit. But in most cases, that moment is not the limit. It is the first test. The first point where the mind begins to protect itself, to conserve energy, to avoid discomfort. That protection is automatic. It is built into you. It is part of how the mind operates. But it is not always correct. Because the mind does not measure your true capacity. It estimates. It predicts. It assumes. And it assumes too early. This is why people stop while they still have more to give. More energy, more focus, more endurance. The signal feels final, but it is only the beginning of resistance. That resistance is uncomfortable. It creates tension. It creates pressure. It creates doubt. And that discomfort convinces you that stopping is correct. But discomfort is not a limit. It is a signal that effort has begun. The moment things feel difficult, the moment the mind starts negotiating, the moment the urge to stop appears, that is where the real process starts. Most people never stay long enough to experience that. They step back too early. They disengage too quickly. They trust the first signal. And because they trust it, they never discover what exists beyond it. Beyond that first signal, there is more capacity, more endurance, more control. But it is only accessible if you continue, if you stay, if you do not obey immediately. This is where separation begins, not between strong and weak, but between those who obey the mind and those who question it. One group stops, the other continues. At first, the difference is almost invisible. A few extra seconds, a few extra steps, a small extension of effort. But that small extension changes everything, because it breaks the pattern, the automatic response, the habit of stopping. And once that pattern is broken, control begins to shift. From the mind to you. The mind may speak first, but it does not have to decide. And the moment you see that, you stop treating discomfort as the end.
The second signal is stronger than the first.
The first one is a suggestion. The second feels like a command. If you continue past the initial urge to stop, the mind does not go silent. It escalates. The discomfort sharpens. The resistance intensifies. The thoughts become more convincing. This is too much. You've gone far enough. You're pushing too hard. At this point, the mind is no longer suggesting. It is attempting to regain control. And most people give in here because the intensity feels real. It feels like the body is reaching failure, but again, it is still early. The mind is reacting to unfamiliar strain, to effort it is not used to sustaining, to discomfort it has not been trained to tolerate. This reaction is predictable because the mind prefers known patterns, predictable effort, controlled environments. When you move beyond those patterns, it interprets it as risk, and it responds by trying to stop you. Not because you are incapable, but because it is unfamiliar. This is where most people misunderstand themselves. They assume the intensity means they have reached their limit. They assume the signal is accurate. But the signal is not measuring capacity. It is reacting to discomfort. And discomfort can be extended, adapted to, controlled. If you stay just a little longer, if you continue just a little further, the intensity begins to change. The chaos settles. The breathing stabilizes. The mind stops escalating. Because you did not obey, you stayed. That moment teaches the mind something new, that the signal was not final, that the discomfort was not dangerous, that effort can continue. This is how control is built, not by eliminating resistance, but by outlasting it. The first time is difficult. The second time is still uncomfortable. But each repetition reduces the power of the signal, because the mind begins to adapt. It recalibrates. It adjusts its expectations. What once felt extreme begins to feel manageable. What once felt like a limit becomes part of the process. This is where endurance begins to form, not through one moment of effort, but through repeated exposure to resistance. Each time you continue, you weaken the mind's authority. You extend your capacity. You stabilize your discipline. And slowly, the signal loses its control. It still appears, but it no longer decides, because you've already gone beyond it. And once you do that, you realize the mind was never the limit. If this message resonates with you, like and subscribe for more content like this. This channel is built for people who are done waiting.
After enough repetition,
The signal begins to change. It still appears. The same voice, the same suggestion, the same urge to stop. But it feels different, less urgent, less convincing, less dominant, because it has lost something, authority. The first time you obeyed it without question. The second time you hesitated. The third time you resisted. Now you recognize it. You expect it. You see it before it fully forms. And that awareness changes everything. Because once a pattern is recognized, it can no longer control you the same way. The signal becomes predictable, almost mechanical, a routine response from the mind. You feel the resistance, but you are no longer surprised by it. You are no longer overwhelmed by it. It becomes part of the process, not the end of it. This is where discipline stabilizes, not because effort disappears, but because your response becomes consistent. You act regardless of the signal. You continue regardless of the discomfort. You move regardless of how it feels. At this stage, the mind is no longer leading. It is following. It adjusts to your behavior, not the other way around. That shift is subtle, but it is powerful, Because it removes hesitation. It removes negotiation. You no longer ask if you should continue. You continue. That consistency creates momentum. Momentum reduces friction. Friction no longer disrupts the process, and the mind adapts again. But this time, it adapts to discipline. The signals still exist, but they weaken. They shorten. They lose intensity because they are no longer reinforced. They are no longer obeyed, and anything that is not reinforced eventually fades. This is how control becomes stable, not through one moment of strength, but through repeated refusal to stop. Day after day, action after action, signal after signal ignored, until the mind no longer interrupts the process. It becomes background, noise without influence. And you continue, not because it became easy, but because you became consistent. And once consistency takes over, the mind is no longer the limit. At a certain point, the struggle becomes quieter. Not because it disappears, but because it changes form. The resistance is still there. The signal still appears. The discomfort still exists. But it no longer disrupts you. It becomes background, something you notice, but do not react to. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They think discipline removes resistance. They think it eliminates effort. It does not. It changes your relationship to it. The discomfort feels the same. The effort feels the same. The signal feels familiar. But your response is different. You no longer hesitate. You no longer pause to consider stopping. You no longer negotiate. You act immediately, consistently. That consistency removes friction, because friction comes from hesitation, from delay, from internal debate. Once the debate is gone, the action becomes clean. This is where performance stabilizes, not because you feel stronger, but because you stop interrupting yourself. Most people are not limited by their capacity. They are limited by how often they stop, how often they step back, how often they obey the signal, how often they disengage. Remove that interruption, and everything changes. Effort becomes continuous. Focus becomes stable. Progress becomes consistent. This is the real advantage. Not intensity, not motivation, not temporary bursts of effort, but uninterrupted action, moving through discomfort without stopping, without questioning, without breaking the pattern. That is what builds momentum, and momentum compounds. Quietly, relentlessly, day after day, step after step, effort layered on effort, until the gap becomes obvious between those who stop and those who do not. One is controlled by resistance, the other moves through it, and that difference grows over time. Because once you stop interrupting yourself, your capacity is no longer limited by your mind. And what remains is how far you are willing to go. In the end, nothing about this is dramatic. There is no sudden transformation, no moment where everything becomes easy, no point where the mind goes silent. The signal remains, the discomfort remains, the resistance remains. What changes is you. You stop reacting to the signal. You stop interpreting discomfort as the end. You stop obeying the first thought. And that shift is enough, because it removes the only thing that was holding you back: interruption. hesitation, internal negotiation. Without those, action becomes continuous, effort becomes stable, progress becomes inevitable. Not fast, not explosive, but consistent. And consistency compounds, quietly, without attention, without recognition. Day after day, you continue, even when it feels unnecessary, even when it feels uncomfortable. And over time, the results begin to appear, not suddenly, but gradually. A wider capacity, a stronger baseline, a more stable discipline. At that point, the difference becomes clear between those who follow the signal and those who move past it. One remains where they started. The other continues to expand, not because they are different, but because they responded differently to the same discomfort, to the same resistance, to the same signal. One stopped. The other stayed. That is the entire difference. The mind may quit first, but it only becomes a limit if you follow it. If this made you see it clearly, like the video and subscribe. The next signal will come. Decide what you do with it.